Hello and welcome to All Villa, No Filler, a podcast all about Aston Villa, the world's greatest football team. As ever, please remember to subscribe to the show. Follow us on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. Aston Villa travel to Paris on Wednesday for the first leg of their Champions League quarter-final against PSG. Who better to find out more from than CBS football journalist, French soccer expert, and Villa fan Jonathan Johnson. Firstly, Jonathan, what exactly are Villa heading into in Paris?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. Always a pleasure. Look forward to these appearances. And yeah, definitely wasn't expecting at the beginning of this season that Villa and PSG would cross paths. Although I did half wonder if it might happen in the league phase, but to be coming up in a quarter final is pretty special. So feels like this game's almost been made for me at some point, given my affiliations with both sides over the years. But very excited to see how it plays out. And I think in terms of what Villa are sort of walking into, obviously everyone will be well versed in sort of PSG's good form, certainly their turnaround in form in the Champions League since they looked pretty down and out after losing against Bayern Munich and then really roared back with a series of impressive wins against Salzburg, Manchester City obviously fighting back from behind at home, and then Stuttgart to make it through to the knockout phase. And since then, they've really gone from strength to strength. You look at their form since the beginning of 2025, and it's really, really impressive. And it's kind of a shame for Villa in a way, because it kind of puts Villa's own excellent run of form, 7 wins on the bounce. Not to shame, but sort of in the shade a little bit, given sort of how this PSG side could finish the domestic season, having just sewn up the Ligue 1 title. They could actually finish the entire campaign unbeaten, which would be a historic achievement. And, I think that just gives us an insight really into the well-oiled machine that Luis Enrique has created with this Parisian side. The fact that it's built around a number of very young, talented French players. It's got a very clear and defined style of play. And obviously, it's a team that likes to create chances, it scores a lot of goals. So, as much as Villa have plenty of threats that PSG will need to be wary of, if you tried to make a list of all the different ways that PSG can be dangerous against a team, you'd be here until after the game is finished. Coming up with all the different possibilities. So it is, it's exciting, it's challenging, it's daunting in a way, but I think it's, something that Unai Emery and his players will absolutely relish.
Yeah, I mean, what has changed for PSG, this season? Because obviously they started it in the Champions League places. They look like they might actually crash out early doors, and then they went and beat Manchester City. And it just sort of feels like since about November, the momentum with them has just almost looked like an unstoppable train, really. So what's clicked? What's happened?
Well, I think you finally got Luis Enrique playing with a group of players who know exactly the role that they're playing in, what's being asked of them, and they're all very complementary players. I think certain changes have been made, tweaks here and there, which have contributed towards the improved fluency in the team. I'm thinking notably of Ousmane Dembele playing as like the false nine and suddenly becoming very prolific. You've got the kind of rotating cast of very, very talented attackers in the two wide positions around them, whether it's Bradley Barcola, whether it's Kvaratskhelia, whether that's Desiree Doué. And then you've got, the predatory profile of Gonzalo Ramos, who can come on from the bench. But you've also got the fixed, midfield trio now, where you've got João Neves, Vitinha, and also Fabian Ruiz. Warren Emery has kind of dropped out of the starting 11 and is sort of trying to work his way back in at this moment in time, which speaks volumes about how this midfield, has become, almost, the envy of Europe with the way that they're playing at the moment. What they managed to contribute towards PSG, building attacks, but also winning the ball back in the middle of the park as well. I would say that you know, PSG are still perhaps vulnerable defensively. We saw that certainly when they got sort of hit against the odds at home to Liverpool, despite having been extremely dominant and then still managed to come out on the losing side there. But, I think it's finally having the players settled and knowing and understanding their positions and what Luis Enrique is asking them for that's really contributed to this uptick in form and, this I mean, it's kind of an air of PSG being more convincing than they perhaps ever have been before in Europe, and that's not to belittle last year's run to the semi-finals, but that felt a little bit more disjointed. It feels like this is more purposeful now, and obviously many people will fancy PSG over the two legs against Villa, and I'm not going to say quite rightly so, but I can understand why. And obviously, it's going to be a challenge for Villa to try and throw a spanner in the works. But it does feel right now, and you said it's like almost like an unstoppable train. It does kind of feel like this kind of momentum is the kind of momentum that top sides build up. When they get to the business end of a season and end up winning trophies.
Yeah, it does slightly remind me exactly 10 years on from when Barcelona, Luis Enrique's Barcelona started the season they weren't very good. And then suddenly in December with Messi, Neymar, and Suarez up top, it just clicked and they went on then and won the treble. It's kind of funny that it's almost 10 years on. He's almost repeating the trip with PSG, it feels like. Until Hurricane Aston Villa step in the way. I mean, look, obviously it's going to be one of the tougher games we've probably played, maybe even in our history. But do Villa have a chance? And if so, what can we do to? How can we do it? How can we get a result? Do you think?
Well, first of all, just to that point, you mentioned sort of 10 years on from Luis Enrique winning the Champions League with Bayern. We're almost 10 years on as well from PSG collapsing in remontada. Now, why am I mentioning that?
Yeah.
Preview of Villa PSG. Well, funnily enough, this is a rematch between Unai Emery and Luis Enrique, who were the coaches sort of over the two legs when PSG romped out in front in the first leg with an almost perfect performance at Parc des Princes, and then still managed to find a way to trip themselves up in the away leg. And Luis Enrique now has spent the best part of two seasons working away to try and undo some of the damage that he and Barcelona at that moment inflicted on PSG and sort of contributed to this collective trauma that PSG have suffered from over the years. I would say that it's lessened in the last year or so, but it's still something that you can never quite be sure whether it's going to come back and afflict PSG. So that's certainly one of the really interesting storylines coming into this. And I think Emery himself is going to be a real key player for this, because you're asking me sort of how Villa can perhaps have, sort of hope of pulling off an upset. And, I don't think we need to look much further back than Villarreal against Bayern Munich in 2022 when Unai Emery was in charge of Villarreal. Nobody really gave them, a hope of knocking Bayern out, yet two perfect performances over two legs from Emery, completely masterminded from start to finish, enabled them to squeeze through. And I think that's certainly the kind of thing that we can hope for as Villa fans over both legs. I think key to that will obviously be keeping it tight in Paris. And we've seen that PSG will create chances against whoever they play against. Will they take them? That's a completely different question. So if PSG are sharp on the night in front of goal, there might not be anything that the Villa can do despite Emi Martinez's best efforts. But as long as PSG aren't putting those chances away and sort of are playing to form, there will always be hope for the team that they're up against, especially when you're a team that's capable of boasting the kind of talent and quality that the Villa have across the pitch. So I think looking back on the last couple of weeks, obviously form has been hugely important. Villa's has enjoyed an uptick of late. There's a bit of winning momentum coming into the game, but also key to that is the fact that Emery will have been able to work really, really hard with the players over the international break, and it was a bit of an extended break as well for most Villa players, with the exception of some of the internationals, and that was hugely important in terms of recharging the batteries. And it feels like almost like since the international break finished, Villa have been sort of working towards the first of these two games, and perhaps we will finally see the fruits of Emery's labour during that extended break period with most of the squad. So it's, I think, for me, in terms of looking at the most encouraging signs for Villa ahead of these two legs, and certainly ahead of the opening leg, is the fact that despite PSG dominating in terms of chances created, there's not necessarily a guarantee that all those chances will be taken. And I think as well, the way that PSG like to dominate possession, that will favour Villa in terms of what they are trying to do in terms of keeping the score quite tight in the first leg. And I think as well, something else that's maybe underrated. I touched on that earlier that Emery and Luis Enrique have come up against each other in European competition before, but they're two coaches who know each other's playing styles very well. And I think with Luis Enrique, there's not the same flexibility that you get with Unai Emery. So I think, it's reasonable to expect that we'll see Villa potentially change style, change system a couple of times during the game. Whereas with Luis Enrique, PSG have sort of one recognized style, and when it's working, obviously it's brilliant. And PSG can play some fantastic free flowing football,
Mm.
but there's a little less pragmatism. I will give Luis Enrique credit. I thought he was more pragmatic against Liverpool than I expected him to be. Sometimes he's quite, I'm not going to say pig-headed, but bloody minded in terms of just soldiering on with sort of it being his way or the highway. And I do think that that could really benefit Villa, especially as we head towards the second leg. If it is tight from the opening leg, that ability to change things up and really take PSG by surprise could ultimately be the trump card for Villa.
Yeah, and I was at the Bayern Munich game where obviously we were defending so deep in a way that you very rarely see Villa play, and they did it incredibly well. And it always felt like on the break the ball was on to Watkins, and I don't know whether there might be a temptation by Emery to try and bait PSG into doing something quite similar and just pushing and pushing and pushing, and then Villa do have them players. Tielemans just getting the ball, and he's perfect for breaking the lines with his passes. And then Rashford running in behind, Watkins running behind, Rodgers as well. It all there is, you know, there is something I think in my head that it could work out. Though of course PSG remain the favourites, but I guess PSG it's hard to choose. You can sort of take your pick really, but I mean, who are the main threats? Would you say who's the standout players really at the moment?
I think the standout players are fairly obvious. You've got a player like Dembele in the form that he's in. He'll be sort of, one of the top kind of targets in terms of making sure that he is kept as quiet as possible over both legs. Like you said, it's kind of take your pick, but I think Desiree Doué is enjoying a very strong run of form at the moment.
Mm.
Kvaratskhelia, okay, he's taking his time to find his feet, but everybody knows what he's capable of on a big stage like the Champions League. Barcola as well has his moments, and has caught the eye more often than not over the course of the season. But then you go into the midfield as well. I think people are stunned by sort of Vitinha's transformation from being sort of a bit part player with Wolves to now being sort of a key player, with one of Europe's top sides. But for me, João Neves, I think, is absolutely
Yeah,
crucial to the way that
amazing
PSG
player.
play as well. And he is, he's a phenomenal player. So if I had to really just pick three, I'd probably say Dembele, Neves, and I mean, if I was going to pick a player from every position, I think Hakimi and Nuno Mendes are both very, very important getting forward.
Mhm.
I'd say perhaps that there's more of an onus on Mendes because if he's having a good defensive game, it means that he's probably applying himself a little bit less going forward. And if he's really applying himself going forward, there's definitely an opportunity to get in sort of around the back behind him. We saw him in very concentrated form up against Mo Salah over both legs against Liverpool. And I think, we can expect, assuming that he's playing on the right, Morgan Rogers to get sort of
Mm.
similar treatment there.
Is there anyone you're really intrigued to see play against PSG for Villa? Is anyone you're sort of intrigued to see how they might get on against a team of this level and what they might bring to the fray?
I mean, a couple of players immediately jump out. First of all, I mean, I'll start from the back and work towards the front. I think Torres, he's going to be really, I mean, he's crucial to the way that Villa play under Unai Emery anyway. But I think, as you mentioned earlier, sort of being able to get in, behind the back in terms of dropping in those passes over the top, he is absolutely vital for that, as is Tielemans. And I think if Villa can find a way to sort of offset his lack of physicality so that he is able to, ping those balls around as often as possible, he is going to be a very interesting player to watch over both legs. I think sort of moving into the midfield, like you mentioned, Tielemans, absolutely vital. I will admit that I'm a little concerned about how often he's been used this season and him sort of
Mm.
running out of gas at some point. But he's been so dependable so far. I don't have too many concerns, at least not going into the opening leg. Boubacar Kamara, coming back to France, sort of made his name as much as a defender, as a midfielder with Marseille before moving to Villa. Now he's a completely different and more complete player. So I think seeing him back in France, sort of at this level, is going to be absolutely fascinating. I'm a little bit worried as well, given the contract situation, because I don't want him to play so well over the two legs that it suddenly becomes obvious that it's going to be quite difficult for Villa to keep hold of him. But otherwise, I mean, I think Asensio is a very obvious one because going up against your parent club, especially when you're enjoying such an unexpected hot run of form, that is always going to be, an absolutely intriguing prospect. But for me, I think the one who could perhaps unexpectedly catch the eye the most is somebody like Morgan Rogers because to PSG, he's probably still a bit of an unknown quantity. Obviously, as Villa fans, we've seen him adapt very, very quickly and become a very important player to this Villa side under Unai Emery. But he's also a player who is still sort of making a name for himself at this level. Obviously, relishes the big stage, and it feels like it's set up for him to have an impressive tie over the two legs. And then the other one needs no introduction. PSG fans will remember him very well from when United knocked them out in the Champions League a few years back. Rashford, he's been linked with PSG so many times that I think many PSG fans just assumed he'd play at Parc des Princes at some point. They just maybe didn't factor in that it might be for somebody else. But I do think this revitalized version of Marcus Rashford means it's almost like a completely different player now, who's potentially going to be in the starting lineup. And I do think, given his quality, and I know there's a bit of a debate, do Villa go with Watkins from the start or go with Rashford? Given the way that we've been discussing that Villa might set up for the game, it does feel like it's kind of tailor-made for Rashford to really play a big role over both games.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Rashford running in behind, I think, will be very, very interesting indeed, particularly if he plays up front. But I guess like you said earlier, that the defense could be something that could be got out with PSG. Is that kind of maybe one of their only real weaknesses? Would you say?
I mean, I think aside from sort of mentally, and obviously that's something Luis Enrique has worked on massively, since he arrived, and it's something I think that is in the process of changing as well. When you look at the mental strength that PSG showed away at Liverpool at Anfield, but I do think positionally PSG, when Hakimi and Mendes are bombing forward, that leaves two central defenders, William Pacho being one, and I'm leaving Marquinhos out deliberately because I think many people are forgetting that he's suspended for the first leg. So, missing not only, one of your defensive talisman, but your captain as well. That is a weakness to potentially exploit, and it's, another factor in the argument that suggests that PSG's defense is wobbly and you can get at it. And obviously, when they play the ball back to Donnarumma as well, it's a bit of a lottery. It's almost like Russian roulette for PSG fans when the ball goes back and there's the collective inhaling of breath that kind of takes the oxygen out of the stadium for a second or so, because you never know what will happen once Donnarumma sort of has the ball at his feet. And that kind of indecision, Villa need to make sure that they're first to every ball that they possibly can, and even the second balls. And I think closing down every single player on the pitch, including Donnarumma, it can pay dividends. And, I think given the way that Emery likes to motivate his players for these kind of games, I don't expect a lack of desire on Villa's part at all. And I do think pressuring all of the members of the defence could, pay dividends at some point during the game.
Right. And I guess looking ahead to the game, do you have is there any optimism you can give to the Villa fans? Do you have any hope yourself? Because you're obviously going to be at the game, and I can believe at Villa Park as well. So, firstly, are you looking forward to being in the stadium? And secondly, is there optimism you can give? Do you think there's a way Villa can get through this and do it?
I mean, I am absolutely looking forward to both games. It's going to be pretty crazy for me personally to see Villa and PSG going up against each other in a Champions League quarter final, having spent years telling people, whether it's in Paris, whether it's in the UK, that I wouldn't ever need to worry too much about them coming up against each other. in a top level competition, because for a long time, sort of Villa and PSG were sort of worlds apart, and they are like the way that Villa have kind of closed that gap in a very short space of time has been incredible. So it's a hugely exciting time to be a Villa fan, and very much looking forward to both games. But is there, hope for Villa over the two legs? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my overall take on it is I do think that PSG shade the two of them, and I probably anticipate that PSG will advance over two legs. Does that mean that Villa can't give PSG a good game over the two legs? Absolutely not. There's nothing stopping Villa from potentially pulling off a shock. And I think the trump card that Villa have obviously is Unai Emery's experience, his tactical awareness, and like I said before, his flexibility as well. It really is, almost like an extra man advantage when it comes to European games, because of the way that he has carved out this reputation as being a magician on these European nights. Granted, most of the time in the Europa League, but like we mentioned earlier with the Villarreal Bayern shock, that's just one example of him making it work. At the Champions League level as well. And it really does feel like whatever happens in this game over two legs between now and the end of the season, getting into a position where we can potentially win silverware is absolutely crucial, because the progress that Villa have made under Emery has been so incredible. It would really feel like a shame to finish the season and not have anything concrete and tangible to show for it. Okay, the FA Cup is probably the most realistic of those objectives, but we saw Borussia Dortmund get to the final against the odds last year, and you look at the way that they kind of, they're almost like a cat with nine lives at times against PSG, sort of living on the edge and never really getting punished. And, that is what can happen up against PSG. So, if PSG are sharp in front of goal, then it's difficult to see Villa sort of being able to do enough over two legs outside of outscoring PSG, obviously. But if PSG do play to form, and I think at least one of the two games over the two legs, they will create more chances than they score, then I think there's always a chance. And that, I think was illustrated very well over the two legs against Liverpool, two very different games. And ultimately PSG came out on top in that. I do think that, Villa can sort of aspire to pulling off a similar kind of shock. So, I'm not going into this week's game assuming that it's already sort of done and dusted and that PSG are going to advance easily. I think Villa have more than a chance of being able to pull off the shock. It's just a question of all of that meticulous preparation that we know Unai Emery puts the team through. Every player understanding exactly what's being asked of them, when to make certain changes, whether that's substitutions, whether that's the changes within the system, and completely carry out Emery's instructions, to the letter. Because if the Villa players manage to do that, there have been bigger shocks in European football history than the PSG potentially being eliminated by Villa. So, I'd like to think that, the Villa fans are going to go to Parc des Princes in fine voice, which I know they will, but actually with some genuine hope of sort of coming away with a result where, we can potentially do something constructive at Villa Park. And I think that's going to be key, keeping the game, keeping the tie alive from the first leg into the second will be absolutely crucial in terms of making sure those fans are on side from the very start and really have belief that Villa can pull it off and knock PSG out in the second leg.
Absolutely. It's just unbelievably exciting to talk about it and think about it. And, I've interviewed you a fair bit over the years talking about various French players linked to Aston Villa. So to be actually able to talk to you about a Champions League game against PSG, the currently creme de la creme of Europe, it's absolutely amazing. So have a great time this week, Jonathan, at the game. And for those who don't know, where can we find you and your work online?
The best place, as always, I think for any self-respecting football journalist is still sort of Twitter X. I think that's the place where most people still are sharing all of their work and other bits and pieces. So at John_Legosip, so that's JON_Legosip. And I'll be sharing plenty of goodies ahead of the game.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for coming on, Jonathan.
No, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me. And looking forward to hopefully being able to toast some Villa success in the next couple of months together very soon. And up the Villa, of course.